Yeah, shockingly, I'm Mark Salisbury. Um, you already sort of told everybody that. I've spent my whole life in the whole world of how college and universities work, how they don't work, how students learn, how they don't learn, how the experience that students can have based on how the college sets themselves up can be really effective in helping students learn, and how colleges can set themselves up in such a way that nobody learns anything. So that's all the stuff that I've done. And as a function of that, I have been eyeball deep in higher ed data for a very long time. And some of that, a big chunk of that, has to do with the kind of data that people use to make choices about going to college or not going to college and which college. And that brings us to the whole money part of it. And so I admit I played a role in making the sausage for a fairly long time in higher ed, the pricing stuff, the financial aid stuff. And I have spent the last 6 years running the Tuition Fit project that some people here know about, and more recently, the Pathways Planning and Insights nonprofit that we'll talk a little bit about later. But just doing everything I can to help the public and help the people who educate students and families understand how this goofy thing works and how people can navigate it to end up finding the educational path that gets to the career that they dream of while preserving their financial future. To me, that kind of should go hand in hand, right? And unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, we've kind of screwed that up. So my personal mission is fix it.
Perfect. We're so glad, like I said, that you are here, and we're going to mainly focus on the FAFSA, but I bet the conversation kind of weaves a little bit here.
Wait, with educators? What? What?
Yeah,
Oh my God.
definitely. So I thought I'd start with just some like introductory kind of question and get us all kind of in the same frame, I guess, of the FAFSA. And again, I mentioned it's October 9th. We haven't seen the FAFSA released quite yet for this 25-26 FAFSA, but can we step back like a year? So a year ago, we saw,
Shuddering.
I know,
Shuddering.
so I'm going to lead in, but we'd love to hear from you because you're the expert. So a year ago, the FAFSA went through a simplification process. We saw it was simplified. Yes, simplified. It was a little bit of a fiasco with the release. The release was delayed. There was lots of news about it. Instead of releasing in October last year, it released in December. Can you just like take us back to a year and kind of what happened, maybe a little just insight into the FAFSA simplification, and then we'll look at this year's timeline. Perfect.
Yeah, no, it's great. When you ever ask that question, the first thing I hear is like the 1930s radio show, and we last saw our hero. So a year ago, the FAFSA was total panic, right? Because 2020, Congress passed this big change in the FAFSA that nothing close to anything we'd seen for decades, really a complete simplification of the FAFSA, but a really dramatic fundamental change of how the thing was, how it worked, the formula that they used, like a bunch of stuff. And then it was, okay, College of Education or Department of Education, you guys put that into place. And that did not go well. So a year ago, it was supposed to release on October 1st, like it always does, and crickets. And it had been back in August that the Department of Education said, yeah, actually, we're not going to have anything close to October 1st. So it's going to come out before January 1st. The federal law is, no, it's got to be out before January 1st. So already saw that there were some problems. They put out the FAFSA estimator, what would have been the sort of, used to be called the FAFSA forecaster, and then they pulled it down after a couple of weeks because it turns out the formula that they put in there was wrong. And so it took another month and a half to get that fixed. Just a boatload of challenges to launch the thing. They finally launched it something like December 28th. Well, guess what? There's more to the FAFSA than just students filling it out. And what became quite clear was this whole other process where the data actually goes from the student sort of passes through the federal government's little toll booth, like the FAFSA toll booth, and then gets sent to the colleges. Well, that part wasn't working. And so the whole thing went to a screeching halt as they realized, uh-oh, we're in a lot of trouble here. They also found out that a bunch of stuff they thought was going to work didn't work. And so data didn't get to colleges until March. And then they found some other problems. So more data didn't get to colleges until May. And the degree to which all of the other systems that colleges use depended on the system not changing wasn't really ever thought through. So colleges subscribe to these giant information management systems that then take the FAFSA data in big batches and then turns it into financial aid offer letters that get printed out and posted on a portal. And those things couldn't operate until you had the FAFSA batch. Well, if you didn't have a FAFSA batch, you were stuck. So you couldn't do anything. And the colleges were saying, well, I guess we just can't do anything. Eventually, they all figured out that we got to come up with some workaround. But in the meantime, nobody was going to move the start of the fall semester back a couple months. So the clock kept ticking. And we were really quite short in FAFSA completion data until August. And in August, all of a sudden, we got caught up to within a couple percentage points of where we were last year in terms of the percentage of students that actually completed FAFSA, or the numbers that we should expect. But all summer long was a giant scramble to fix, repair, fix again, clean up, come up with a workaround, whatever it was, just to get that data through the institutional pipeline, get it out to students with offers, everything else, so that we can start the semester on time and students that need financial aid money have it. What that meant was the process for this year wasn't going to work as it normally does. Usually, the upcoming year's FAFSA set of questions, every year they kind of go through and they tweak a question, change another thing, little this, little that. Congress might pass a law that says, you know what, we can give Pell Grant money to guys in prison or women in prison that we didn't before, things like that. So they have to change a little thing. But that then, the prototype of that gets released in April or May, because the federal law requires that you get a 90-day comment period before it then goes back into the machine and gets released on time. There was nobody to do that this time around. So we're already behind way back in April, May of what we're going to do this year. So in order to still have a shot at releasing this thing in the fall, no changes from the FAFSA organizationally or flow, question, language, any of that stuff, no changes were made from last year to this year, which means for those of you who helped lots of students through, there's a number of items where the question, the language is just clunky, and it doesn't really mean what it sounds like it means. That we're stuck with again for another year. But we had, because we were sort of stuck that way, because if they changed anything, they had to put it out for comment, and that would have pushed us back even further. But the one smart thing that they did was to say, you know what, once we change all this stuff in the technical side of the FAFSA, why don't we do what we didn't do last year and beta test it with people to see if it works? So this year, October 1st, there's actually a small proportion of students that are able to fill out the FAFSA right now. But it is a very small proportion. And some of you may have seen it. School districts or schools were able to apply to be a part of this beta test. And you had to have certain qualities of your demographic, right? You had to have a lot of students that would be low income or first generation or not the typical traditional student to get through and be one of these beta testing organizations. But for the next 2 months, they're beta testing each stage of the FAFSA, which includes some colleges being part of the beta test, because the colleges are beta testing, receiving the data and turning it into financial aid offers. All that's happening now, October, November, and then December 1st or thereabouts. Fingers crossed, everybody. The FAFSA will be released to the general public, and it will supposedly work. And then we should be relatively close to the process like it's been in the past, where students fill out FAFSA, submit it, goes through, gets sent to the schools very quickly. School can process whenever they choose to. Some do, some right away, some don't. But everything in that system ought to flow the way it's supposed to.
Awesome. You answered like all of my introduction questions in that one question, because my next follow-up was just the timeline for this year, which is approximately December.
Mm-hmm.
And then my follow-up to that, which you already answered, was just, are we going to see any significant changes in the 25-26 FAFSA? And the answer is no. It's going to look very similar to.
It's going to be very similar. Some of the, if you know, for those of you who actually still have the nightmares, most of us have blocked it out, and it's totally reasonable. But if you do remember any of the sort of weird glitches, so you might see some flow that just looks slightly different, but only because they fixed the thing that was screwed up before, right? But substantive language changes that were confusing, those are still going to be there.
All right, everybody, we want to open it up to your questions. Mine was introducing just the timeline and kind of some of the background for all of this. And so if you're joining me on Nearpod right now, what I'm going to put up is a collab board, and this will be the opportunity for you to put any questions you have. We're going to do a little participant Q&A here in our next 30 so minutes that we have together to address some of your questions. So here's that Nearpod link if you're not already in Nearpod. And I have a very simple title, which just says FAFSA Q&A, but this is an opportunity. Ooh, there, we're already getting them. So this is an opportunity for you to ask some questions that you have. And again, we'll address as many as we can in the time that we have. You'll notice on Nearpod, do you see there's like a little heart feature? It's kind of like a thumbs up, like that can upvote some questions as well. So if you're thinking, if you see some of them and you have a similar question, yeah, many of you are already doing that. It can upvote it, which then we know, ooh, that's a question many of you have. Mark, are you in the Nearpod where you can see some of these questions, or do you want me to filter through them?
Why don't you just go ahead? I'm actually not
Okay.
in the Nearpod, and I apologize for being a less
No,
engaged.
that is totally fine. I will highlight some of them. So yeah, feel free to add them in, and I'll start with, can you highlight some of the questions with the confusing, clunky language? Can you kind of mention
Oh
some?
boy. There are some questions. So one of the items that was confusing before was just right at the beginning. It used to be that the FAFSA sort of used to start with the presumption that the normal majority of students are the very typical traditional mom and dad at home, they're paying for everything, they're going to send the kid off to school. And then if the student wasn't in it wasn't that, and they were a student that was a foster student, or somebody was homeless, or they'd been in the system, or something else like that, that you had to sort of demonstrate that was so. One of the biggest changes in the FAFSA was to essentially flip the whole presumption of what's the typical student who's filling out the FAFSA look like. The majority of FAFSAs are not traditional students. The majority of FAFSAs are 27-year-old, somebody with 2 kids, and they're going back to school. That's the majority of FAFSAs, right? So now they decided the way they've framed it is such that it sort of starts with identify if you're one of the categories that would require a special consideration for some reason. So instead of asking right away, like instead of framing it as assuming that you're a traditional student, it sort of starts out as if assuming that you're not. And so that threw some people right away. Then when you get to that, if you're any of these kinds of scenarios, homeless, foster, in the system, undocumented parents, you have to select some of those, and then it takes you in a different pipeline. But that sort of threw people because it was a first time out. The other thing that I recall being it wasn't so much, I guess I shouldn't say that this is exactly clunky language, but it really did throw people. We've told people for years that the FAFSA is going to ask for your income information, number of people in the household, and then assets and savings, self-report assets and savings in the bank account stuff. So a bunch of people were filling out the FAFSA and then never got those questions. And those questions about assets and savings. And so, wait, well, how come I didn't get those questions? What happened here, right? And the way the new FAFSA works is when you plug in your social security number and you connect to your contributor and they link that information, and your AGI is below, I think, $65,000, it just skips all those asset and bank account questions. And it just cuts right to the chase because you're going to qualify for some kind of Pell money. And that threw people because they were really sort of, wait a minute, did I miss some questions here? The last thing that I remember the language being clunky was, so the student has to, when they finish theirs and then they sign their FAFSA, and then the contributor, parent, filling out their part and they sign it and submit it. There was this confusion about who submits when, especially when parents were originally, the days where, the parents create the student's account and essentially did the FAFSA themselves without really the student doing it. This now is it's much harder for the family to actually do that. It's the student's FAFSA and the student has to get things started. And there was some real problems that I think they've cleaned up mostly, where the parent would hit submit and the student hadn't signed it yet. And so there was the language wasn't really clear about that. And so it's really important for the students to know that they're the ones submitting the FAFSA. And so the parent fills out their section, but they don't submit it, the student does. And this was stuff that just wasn't really clear in the language. I know that there's a couple others that I'm forgetting right now off the top of my head, but they're documented in some of the other resources that we've talked about. But just to tell people, expect to read a question or two that still seems like, what are they actually asking here? And if you're not sure, really use those pop-up bubbles and those different things that are like the circle with the question mark that says a little bit more to explain that question.
Great. It's in the chat. What was the income threshold that skips the asset portion or the banking portion?
So there's two factors here. There's the number of the two biggest drivers of Pell Grant eligibility are the adjusted gross income of the family unit, right? And then the number of people in the household, right? It's those two numbers. So depending on the number of people in the household, that income threshold is going to jump around a little bit. But as a student, you're filling it out and did you file taxes or not, whatever. It'll ask you a question about if you have any assets or income to the student. Then when you get to the contributor part, if the family has to link to their tax return, and based on that link to the tax return, if the AGI was, I said 65,000, but that can move a little bit. If you've got a family that's got 8 people in the household, it'll be lower than 65,000. That threshold will be, right? Because you got that money to have to distribute across more people. So that just means it's harder to make things, pull things together. So, but think of it as that 55 to 65,000 threshold, because you don't have that many students that have 8 people in the household and something like that.
All right, a quick question, just because some people are commenting, we want to make sure we have the clear and correct information. Which year's tax information is used on the FAFSA?
Great question, because this is another labeling, naming thing that's done by data nerds, not people who actually have friends and interactions with other humans. So this actually is a great question, because it's going to go to something that people might find students running into right now. The tax return that gets used is the tax return that is 2 years before the year of the fall that the student's starting in college, right? I'm not going to repeat that. I'm going to say it in a different way, because that was terribly clunky, but that's the way it works. So if your student is the student starting in the fall of 25, then it's the 2023 tax return that gets used. The students that just started in the fall of 24, that's the 2022 tax return that gets used. Now, the reason why that's super important to know, you can go on to studentaid.gov right now and find the 24-25 tax return. I'm sorry, the 24-25 FAFSA. You can find it on there right now. There's lots of people right now who have gone on, clicked on the 24-25 FAFSA, start filling it out, because it's 24-25, right? Like, why would that? Makes total sense to me. What they don't know is they actually need to fill out what is called the 25-26 FAFSA. So the students that are seniors right now, their families, the FAFSA that they're going to fill out is labeled for the year that student is starting in college. So that's the FAFSA that they're going to fill out. So when a family says, "Oh, I already did our FAFSA," sorry, no, you didn't. And the labeling's not great, but that's just a really important little detail to know.
Thank you for clarifying. All right, lots of upvotes on this one. What would you say, Mark, are the top 3 mistakes people make when they fill out the FAFSA?
One, assuming that they're not going to get any aid, so they just don't fill it out. Like that's the thing number one. Like it doesn't matter. I'm not going to college anymore. It doesn't, like, just making that assumption. That's mistake number one. Mistake number two is, as they're filling it out, the parents, when it asks about assets, that they include assets in there that they shouldn't include. So if you work a job for a large organization like a school district, let's say, and you have a TIA, CREF, 401k, and you've got a couple $100,000 in there over years of that building up, that's retirement money. That's your 401k. That's retirement money, and you don't include that in the section and totaling up assets. But it is really common for when the people says, they read the question, it says, "What are all your assets?" And so they just start adding stuff up, and they don't really know the difference between a 401k and what's not, and they just start adding and adding and adding. And pretty soon they have put in a number that is way beyond what they actually should put in there. So that's thing number two that I just see all the time. Thing number three is probably a tie. It's like a 2 or 3 way tie here. One of them is that if the family has any sort of 529, since the student's the beneficiary of it, the student actually includes that in their assets. So all of a sudden the student lists that they have $50,000 in assets in the student section of the FAFSA. And if there's a 529 that the parents own and the student's the beneficiary, that 529 needs to be in the parents' assets, not the student's assets. Okay. So that's one, for people who have 529s are fortunate enough to have that kind of educational savings. That's certainly one of them. That's sort of tied with the student that just decides, I don't like mom and dad, so I'm independent. And so they just decide that they're an independent. And the way the new FAFSA works is if you say you're independent, it just sort of skips to a bunch of stuff and you can finish it. The FAFSA assumes that anybody under the age of 24 is a dependent of parents unless they tick off one of those other options. And if you tick off at the very beginning, if you tick off you're an independent student, because you just say, I'm running my own life, I'm independent, that's a different construct than what this thing means, right? So they can then they'll miss a bunch of those items about whether they are a foster in the system or whatever, and it'll just skip to a whole nother sort of assumption. So the corollary to that is for divorced students whose parents are divorced. It's pretty common for a divorce agreement to say that the parents take turns claiming the student as their dependent on their taxes just for tax purposes and fairness purposes. And so it's not unusual for a parent to think, well, I don't claim this student as a dependent, or I just claimed them 2 years ago, but I didn't claim them last year. And it's really important for parents to understand when we're talking about the FAFSA and for the student to understand that when you're going to identify who your contributor is for in a divorced or legally separated situation, that whole notion of dependent when it comes to tax returns and all that stuff is not relevant to the conversation here. What's relevant is when your parents are divorced, then it's going to ask you for a contributor, and that contributor needs to be the parent that provided the most financial support over the last 12 months. And it has nothing to do with which parent claimed you as a dependent on their taxes last year, this year, next year. And it's not just where you live, it's which parent provided the most financial support. So that's probably sort of like a tie for third in where the biggest mistakes are.
Perfect. Honestly, that answered a couple. There was a question about clarifying contributors, and you kind of looped that in, which is perfect for the answer. All right, this one I think can get complicated. So the student aid index can sometimes get complicated. So, Mark, can you simplify how is that index calculated and how do the colleges use it?
You know what? My front door's ringing.
It's a
I
tough
gotta
question.
go. Just kidding. So yeah, this is a train wreck. There's just no other way to put it. But it's not necessarily a worse train wreck than before. It's just a different train wreck. So remember that used to be the outcome of the FAFSA used to be called expected family contribution. And basically, because that was the name of it, the public assumed, well, then that's what it means. It's a dollar amount, and that's what it says it's it's expected family contribution, so that's what I'm expected to contribute. And then the colleges said, well, if that's what you're going to say, I'm not going to argue with you. Sure, that's your expected family contribution. That formula underneath that was never designed to produce that kind of a result for the entire population. But the colleges said, you know what? The FAFSA is free and the CSS profile costs money and it's a lot more arduous to finish it. Let's just do this. Let's just all use the FAFSA. Let's all just say that expected family contribution means expected family contribution and then start from there with every student. So I say all that to say The whole thing before was bunk, but the label of it got everybody to just sort of buy into it. And the families didn't know because why would they, right? They're just coming through the process like every year, right? So this is the big change, the student aid index. It's supposed to be an index in the same way that you have in the financial markets, you have an index where the numbers in the index only have any meaning in relationship to the other numbers in that index, right? So the student aid index, from the perspective of it actually representing anything broadly, it's really just supposed to mean that somebody with a smaller student aid index has relatively less to pull from to pay for school than somebody with a larger student aid index. But how much? Don't know. That's not our deal anymore. That's the way the FAFSA is now designed to work. Okay. They're still using that number as an actual dollar amount by the federal government and any states that still use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for need-based aid. So at that very low level, right, the 0, the 1,000 SAI, the 7,000 SAI, that's still being used as an actual number to say, okay, you're going to still qualify for a Pell Grant or a partial Pell Grant. But for colleges, you're not supposed to use that number as an actual representation of what a student and family should be able to pay for college. That's just supposed to be sort of a relative thing. You figure it out. That's how this is supposed to work. At least that's what the federal government told and did, and sort of said, colleges, good luck. So, well, how that actually played out, all the colleges and all their giant software systems that they pay for to run all the financial aid stuff, all those software systems did was just take out the letters EFC and put in the letters SAI and didn't change anything else. So it looked like to the public, it was the same thing. Now, the colleges were sort of also aware, although they're sort of compelled to deal with this, that the SAI for any individual student is going to be higher as you get farther up the scale, because the formula is done differently now. And low on the scale, more students are going to qualify for aid than they were before. But as you get up to what was maybe a 15,000 EFC, that's probably going to be more like an 18,000 SAI in general. And a 25,000 EFC is probably going to be like a 30,000 SAI. Get way up there, and a 50 is going to look like a 70. Now, first world problems, right? If you got a 50,000 SAI and I tell you you got a 70,000 SAI, like for me, I'm like, yeah, you go deal with it in your Lexus. But for the rest of us, that's an issue, right? But that's essentially, the colleges were stuck with that and had to face this other reality that was, we can't just charge people more than we did last year by like tens and $20,000 and expect that to work. So what has happened as a function of this is colleges really don't know how to use the SAI. When it's an index, you need a whole bunch of other numbers to give any one number meaning, right? So that very first year when you don't have any other numbers, any one number means nothing, right? You don't have anything to work with. And so the colleges are really stuck. Now, part of what happened as a result of that is a growth in the number of schools that use the CSS profile. And for those of you who don't know, the CSS profile, it actually stands for something, College Scholarship Services. That's another form privately run by our good friends at the College Board. And it asks a whole bunch more questions than the FAFSA does. Many schools even use the document upload, which requires people to actually upload taxes and stock portfolios and evidence of how much their house is worth and all this other stuff. But it asks a lot more questions that allows a school to actually come up with enough information to maybe say, I think this is what you should pay for college. So a bunch more schools started adding that. So we're seeing schools like Arizona State University. Why would they need a CSS profile? Well, they started using it last year. And you might see more schools do that in the coming years if they're trying to still award aid based on need. But right now, the colleges that are just taking the FAFSA, they're sort of forced to either pull additional tax return data that they have access to if they want, or to just say, you know what, we're just doing award aid based on merit. We're going to have a couple thousand here, a couple thousand there that we'll throw in for need if it's obvious, and call it good. And it is sort of where higher education, most institutions that just do the FAFSA, that's where they are anyway. For those of you who look at the numbers that say, you know, each school, well, this is the proportion of need that they meet. Most of the time when you see that data point for a particular college, that's just an accident. That's not because they're shooting for that or aiming for that. That's because they give out a bunch of merit aid and then they run the numbers and go, oh, accidentally, we covered on average about 70% of need. It wasn't because they were trying to, it was just because that's how it played out.
So much good information. And again, people asked about the CSS profile, and so you don't even see these questions, Mark, but you're looping in.
I'm not, I just, yeah.
Which is great. There's a good question about financial aid offers, but I'm going to hold that one for just a minute and still focus on FAFSA for a moment. And so there's a question about, can students with undocumented parents, can they complete the FAFSA online, or do they have to do signature on paper and mail it in?
That was been a thing that this year had better work or else. Because last year it was supposed to be exactly this, that the student with undocumented parents who in prior years ran into a buzzsaw because they couldn't get past anything because parents couldn't put in a social security number. Now the new system is supposed to be so that the parents don't have to put in a social security number if they don't have one. They can put in other information just to get so that student can complete a FAFSA. That is supposed to now work cleanly. That's probably one of the number one things they're testing in that beta process right now, is to make sure that this thing that we went big on, that we promised everybody, that then blew up on the launch pad last winter, this year we get that right. But a student who's with undocumented parents is supposed to have no problem finishing the FAFSA now.
I just lost my question. Oh, okay. So you talked about divorced parents previously and like how that works with contributors. Does the FAFSA have any way to verify which parent provides the most support? There's students who want to use parents with lowest.
Not really. So the federal government's provided very, very little guidance on this. And what has sort of evolved into the generally accepted way of doing this is you take both parents. It doesn't really matter if one has a lot more money than income than the other. But let's say the student is 50-50 at both parents, give or take, right? So it's that kind of a relationship. And one parent has a much higher income than the other one. But both kids have a room at that parent's house and there's a bed. Both parents feed the student the same McDonald's hamburgers and the kid eats the same Cheetos. And the student lives with the parent that doesn't make as much money, and that parent drives them around and pays for the odd expense for school and a new pair of soccer shoes and all this other stuff. Don't get really into the like calculator Excel spreadsheet, which parent provides more. Instead, is it reasonable? Which parent do you have a reasonable argument to say, you know what? Yeah, that parent, you could reasonably make the case that that one provides 51% of the support, then just stick with that parent and that's fine. So the federal government has not been chasing this one down. I'll bet someday there's some absolutely bizarre scenario. It's like Elon Musk's 12th kid and sorry, no offense, Elon, I'm sure you're listening or tweeting about it right now. But no, there's not been a great deal of really diving in on this one. And you need to think about that particular item holistically and not just which parent makes more money.
Here's another scenario question, kind of tied. I'm trying to clump these together a little bit with contributors. So if a student is living with a foster parent, parent is not living, whose information should they report?
Well, the student will report their own information first, right? And then they'll be asked the question, are you a foster parent, foster student, are you in a foster home? Are you homeless? Are you, there's a whole series of things. And in each of those cases, it's not biological parent, the student ticks it off. It essentially is, okay, that's an independent. So that student's independent. And then it goes to a different cycle. In fact, you know what? This is a perfect time to mention, Amanda, Amanda, the prototype for the FAFSA. So there is a prototype that's already available for the 25-26 FAFSA that you can go and look through, and you can actually play out different scenarios and see how it plays out. And they've got a number of different examples you can see, for example, a scenario which a student is a foster student and living with a foster parent. And it's really important to people to know, you've got to put in you'll be asked for a code to access once you go to this link, you'll be asked for a code. And that code is prototype 2526, all one word. I've actually talked to a couple people recently who've said, I put it in, nothing happened. I said, try it again. And it worked the second time. So you might just have to, we're not talking about the most sophisticated tech here. But this is an awesome way to just look and see what's the FAFSA look like for this type of student? What's the FAFSA look like for that type of student? What does it look like for this type of family scenario? It really makes it less daunting so that when you are helping a student with this, you can feel like, oh, I'm not just totally winging it and I don't know what I don't know. You can actually see how this plays out.
I just dropped the link to that in the chat, and I mentioned this at the beginning, but we will share with you a whole list of resources that Mark has put together, but also things that were mentioned during the session. So we have about 12 minutes, and I know, remember, we want to save some time for some resources, but this question I think is a good one. So maybe you can briefly kind of answer, is there an effort to standardize the financial aid offer letters?
Well, that's easy. Yes, there's an effort. Is it a successful effort? Oh, that's a different question. There's several efforts to standardize the financial aid offer letters. To be fair, this is an effort that's been going on for 20 years. And every time it gets somewhere in Congress, it ends up getting lobbied to be, here's a template and it's optional for colleges to use it. And every college is special, and so they don't. Then there is a private effort that is sort of a combination of large higher education membership organizations, American Council on Education and the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And they're trying to coax their people into at least agreeing on some language. How many of you love being on administrative committees at your school because you get stuff done so fast? Like just immediately a decision gets made, boom, you've implemented it within a week, and everybody's good. Yeah, I thought so. So that's exactly how this thing is going. And I would not expect standardized financial aid mandatory anything anytime soon. It's been in the updates for the Higher Education Acts each time it comes around, and you hear rumblings in Congress. And I am lucky or unlucky enough to hear from some of those Congress people's offices. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? Yeah, great. Yeah. And then 6 months later, crickets. So, yeah, there's an effort. You go, girl. So anyway,
Good answer. I think everyone, we have about 9 minutes left in our session. I think we answered a bunch of the questions in a lot of the other answers. I know we have a few kind of still lingering, and I apologize if we didn't get to all of the questions in your question. We can maybe stay around a little bit at the end, but we do want to share some resources with you before we wrap up. So I'm back on the Nearpod here, and if I can invite you back there. Mark has a couple just helpful resources. I kind of put them all in here, but Mark, maybe we'll just talk about a couple of them, but I'll
sure.
share them all. So the first one, again, I'm not sure if you see Nearpod, Mark, but the first one is Pathways, Planning and Insights. You should all see it on Nearpod, but you can tell us about it, Mark.
Yeah, sure. So as you probably can tell, I talk about this a lot, that we can share data with people all the time, and then they still look like deer in headlights because there's so many other things that are going on underneath the hood that people need to know in order to be able to make use of that data, right? Here's a great example. If somebody waits to find out their SAI until they fill out the FAFSA, and then they're shocked when they see this really high number, well, what should have happened is somebody should have told them what was coming a couple years ago so that they knew what was happening. This is very common for low income immigrant families where they largely working with a cash economy. They run a cash business and they don't have a 401k and they don't have 529s at their disposal. And so then they've got a whole bunch of money saved up in a bank account for their college expense for their kids. And then when they get to the FAFSA, they have to put that on the FAFSA as money in a bank account. And all of a sudden their SAI is way up and they don't qualify for a Pell Grant and their family's living on $45,000 a year. That's crazy. And just nobody told them. So I decided to launch a nonprofit last year where it's really designed for families and parents that are parents of 9th and 10th, 11th graders that need to understand how this whole system works so they can better navigate it. And everything from understanding how to figure out, well, what is our price range for college, just as a family, to understanding that you literally can get a college degree and pay nothing for it. And I don't mean join the army. I mean, you literally can get a college degree and pay nothing for it. And I don't mean be an athlete. It's true. You can actually get a college degree. There's hundreds of companies that's a part of their benefits package where you can take classes while you work there. It doesn't cost you a dime. But and then you could take those and transfer in somewhere. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can do this, but the public just doesn't know about it. So we do a series of workshops. We do them in about 25 languages so that families in Spanish and Hindi and Chinese, you name it, we'll do it in that language so that they can understand it. It's so common that we sort of depend on the children of non-native speakers to be able to translate to their parents. And maybe they can in some cases, but when it comes to the financial stuff, that's just not something that we should be asking them to do. So we built this whole platform where we've got calculators, we've got tuition fit data that helps people. And what we do for schools is we make it free to the schools, and we just try to find a sponsor in your local community. So a bank or a credit union or a other kind of financial organization or the community foundation. So if anybody's interested in that, you can reach out to me. And we have found that people who teach finance in their schools will use some of the workshops in their classes, some of the calculators in their classes. We also do live Q&A sessions, sort of like this one, where people ask lots of questions and we answer lots of questions. And if they ask really personal questions, they put them into a question box, and then we send them an answer by email so that they don't get sort of outed. Nobody likes to say in a public group, yeah, I went through bankruptcy twice. What should I do? Not really fair to ask them. So that's pathways. If people are interested in that, we can certainly talk about that for your school. It's turned out to be really helpful for families to, one, know that they can actually aspire to post-secondary education, because a lot of times folks just assume they can't, and then how they can ensure that they line that up. So that was thing number one. What's thing number two?
Resource number 2, is that
Yes.
right? Yeah, second one in the lineup was, oh, hopefully, is this working? Mine comes up with a little error, but no, National College Attainment Network. We put that
Yes.
link in there.
Right. So love these people because they changed their name to make it more accurate about what we actually really want for all these students. It used to be called the National College Access Network. They changed the name to the National College Attainment Network, meaning let's get them to and through and graduated, which is great. They have been a fantastic leader in pulling together resources to help schools and organizations educate students and educate families about how the financial aid processes work. So FAFSA completion stuff, other resources that people can point to help students that are in unique situations. I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's one other site that is, I think you'll find it for the National College Attainment Network, but it's called understandingfafsa.org, and it's just about understanding the FAFSA. And it's that kind of stuff that NCAN collects and has just boatloads of resources for people that need it.
That was the next one in my lineup, understanding.
Oh, wait a minute. Did I read your mind again?
Yeah, so I
Okay.
just put it on your Nearpod. Don't worry, everybody. I'm going to give you a Google Doc with all of these. So we're just kind of highlighting what they are, but then we'll give you a Google Doc with all of the resources. The only other one, we did the prototype. That's one of the
Yes.
resources that we put in there. And then the last one, yeah, was this one. I'm putting it on Nearpod. I'm just kind of giving you a glimpse at them, but it was the Education Quest Foundation. They had those clickable checklists in there.
Yeah, that's right. Because the previously, like the stuff from the Department of Education, studentaid.gov, yes, they're trying, but they're not educators. They don't know how to build like simple checklists that don't really scare the pants off anybody. So these folks at Education Quest just designed some much simpler looking checklists that are they didn't make me like run and hide behind my chair. Like that was kind of important. So those are useful if you want to bring something, just grab another resource that you can use to help students.